A dismally short supply. Canada's political leaders at all levels of government and actually from every political stripe agree that the country needs more housing units. But there's a lot of debate on how exactly to address the problem or the crisis. So we're bringing back our front bench, two people with lots of behind-the-scenes knowledge on what might be holding back that type of construction. Christy and John Tory are with me. John, I want to start with you because you were pretty recently actually the mayor of a city in which the housing crisis is being felt probably most acutely, if not there, and also in Vancouver. I know there's tons of finger pointing going on right now with sitting politicians, so I'm hoping to avoid that here. And if you were to identify what you think the biggest impediments to being able to meet the crisis where it's at, what would you say?
Well, I think it's immediacy in the sense that even if you fix all the problems, as somebody just said, I think it was the minister, you know, you're going to take 2 or 3 years to build this housing. But having said that, they're finally, and this is back to this question of being nimble, they're finally putting some of the building blocks in place. The industry has said, and now they have to be held to account to some extent by having some targets that are going to be, you know, put in front of them to sign on to. They've said for a long time now that taking off the HST, the GST on rental accommodation was going to help. So, okay, that's done. The second thing that had to be done was the speeding up of the approval process, which is largely, not entirely, municipal. And I can tell you in the case of Toronto, and I'm sure it's true in other cities, Christy might be able to speak to the West, but that has been done with the setting of new goals to get. And I think we heard somebody saying from the caucus that it should be 2 years, or I guess your expert you had on earlier, saying it should be 2 years. And that's not far off what it should be. It can't be 4 or 5 years, you know, when people are borrowing the money to buy the land. And then 5 years simply means they don't even start building the housing until 5 years from now. And that's just not adequate. And then the final thing is the governments have to work together. I mean, right now, what you've got, I can only speak for Ontario and Southern Ontario, is you've got 3 governments, municipal, provincial, and federal, and I'm not finger pointing, I'm just saying they're all off doing their own thing. And Doug Ford, the premier here, has said he would take off the HST on rental accommodation, so that's one notch that's good. But there are many other things they have to sit down and work out together with the industry to actually make this happen in the foreseeable future, because otherwise it is going to take much longer than people have that don't have housing and longer than governments have, who are all going to be thrown out if they don't find a better way to deal with this.
Would you agree, Christy, that different levels of government on the issue of housing have traditionally been pretty siloed in their approaches?
I think that's true, yeah. I mean, you know, so for example, John is right about the tax on rental housing. Ron Basford, when he was in Pierre Trudeau's government, brought that in. It got canceled. Every government I've been a part of lobbied Mr. Chrétien, Mr. Martin, Mr. Harper, Mr. Trudeau. They've been in power for 10 years, and now they're finally saying they're going to do something. So that's great. That will make a difference. But I think, all levels of government own a lot of land in cities. They have opportunities to open up some of that land for use. John is right. The approval process is way too slow. But we also, I think, need to think, and so I agree with much of what he said. I think that we also need to think about what we're zoning for. Because what we're doing in cities across the country now is we're building homes for the very rich and the very poor. And, you know, air rights and zoning and how land is used is something that belongs to the public. And so municipal politicians in particular, I think, need to be thinking about how do we serve the public broadly by making sure the zoning we put on this land is going to result in middle-class housing being available. And nobody's really kind of figured out how to make that happen or had the courage to do that. But that really lands in the lap of municipal governments. Provinces have some coercive power to do that. So does the federal government. But really, until we decide, you know, well, I guess we've got enough million-dollar condos, we're not going to start figuring out how we're going to build middle-class housing. It's a much bigger problem than just the cost and the taxes, although I know that is. It's actually some really hard decisions that need to be made at the city level, and that hasn't happened anywhere in the country that I'm aware of.
The Housing Accelerator Fund that the feds have proposed, John, is meant, I think, in large part to incentivize a lot of that. The Conservatives are also proposing a plan that they say will incentivize it. It's just the reverse, right? We're going to withhold infrastructure money if you don't kind of increase density and zone in different ways or build enough housing. The Liberals are using this Accelerator Fund to try and incentivize it. Do you think that either one is a good approach?
Well, I think the withholding of money, I'm not sure will work, because at the end of the day, you have to have the infrastructure in place before the housing can get built, regardless of how long the approval process is. So I think the way that the government is doing it maybe has more promise. And there is no question that when they, for example, on the rapid housing program, which they did without fanfare, and which actually was very successful, certainly in Toronto it was, and I think in the big cities, they said, we're giving you this money. It was a lot of money. It produced instant results, but it had to. If you didn't do what you said you were going to do within a year, then the money wasn't there. And so I think in that sense, those kinds of things that use a bit of a carrot and a stick approach are necessary and are going to work. But again, you can't build housing overnight. And by the way, I do think Christy's point about how you zone. I mean, in Toronto, we just before I left office, we changed it so there could be duplexes and triplexes and fourplexes in every neighborhood in the city. Whereas previous to that, 70% of the city couldn't even have that, let alone a mid-rise, building that might house middle-class Canadians. So there is work to be done on that front. But I think these incentive programs should be more incentive-based as opposed to punishment, and should speed up the process by saying this money's here, but it won't be, or the infrastructure won't be if you don't step up.
Last question to you, Christy. You both have been in politics for a long time. You're no stranger to public pressure on different issues. What's your assessment, kind of against a historical context, of the degree to which you feel like the housing issue right now is the big political pressure on politicians? Like, do you think the political will be there as a result of that?
I don't know the answer to your second question. It should be, but I can tell you this is such a big issue. I mean, when people are talking about losing their homes, and people wait every month to see that bank statement and cry because they can no longer afford the interest payments. I mean, that's happening to millions of people in the country. It doesn't get more real than that for voters. And I think politicians at all levels had better be paying attention to this, because, we've been asking, provinces and municipal governments have been asking the federal government to do a lot for a long time. Now, if they don't come through, I think they are going to pay a real political price for it.
And that includes, I know you've got the clock, Vassy, but that includes people who are housed, not just people who don't have a home. And so that's a serious problem. A lot of people who are housed have big problems with affordability.
Oh, no kidding. And with each interest rate hike, it gets worse and worse. I'll leave the discussion there. Thank you so much. I appreciate your analysis and insights and leaning into your expertise this evening. John Tory and Christy Clark, we've been discussing the government's slew of affordability announcements over the last 48 hours. It all started